Hi there. In this video, we'll be talking about food chains. So what is a food chain? So food chain is a diagram or a visual representation that shows how energy flows through an ecosystem. In a food chain, we use arrows to represent or show the flow of energy through the ecosystem. What this really means is that the food chain is showing me which organisms eat other organisms in the ecosystem in order to obtain the energy that they need. Here's an example of a food chain that we'll be looking at today. Here we can see another example of a food chain where we see different organisms in the ecosystem with arrows showing the direction of energy flow. So before we dive deeper into how to read, analyze, and create food chains, let's have a quick review of a previous unit that's necessary to understand what food chains are representing. So we know that all living things require energy in order to function and stay alive. We also know that the ultimate source of all of the energy in the universe comes from the sun. We know that I don't directly get my energy from the sun, but if I were to trace it back far enough, we would know that all energy in the universe actually originates in the sun. We know that plants, in order to produce energy, create their own food using that energy from the sun through the process of photosynthesis. You also should remember that animals and humans then eat those plants or other animals in order to obtain the food that they need to produce energy. Now that we've reviewed where plants and animals get the food they need to create energy, we can talk about how food chains work. So in a food chain, we have several different types of organisms that we'll need to understand. First, we have what's called a producer. Just like we just reviewed on our previous slide, a producer is one of those organisms which produces or creates its own food through the process of photosynthesis. For our purposes, we're talking about plants. A consumer, on the other hand, is an organism that needs to consume or eat a producer or another animal in order to get the food it needs to create energy. Consumers can't make their own food, so they need to, again, consume or eat a producer or another consumer in order to get that food that they need. Next, we have another important vocabulary term, which is predator. So you may have heard this word before. Predator is just an organism which preys upon or eats other organisms. Predators, we'll see, are higher up on the food chain than the prey that they eat. Finally, we have the prey, which again is that organism which is hunted, killed, and eaten by another organism as food. We'll go ahead and look at how to actually analyze what's happening in a food chain. So when we look at a food chain, we always want to start at that first rung or that first chain, which will always be a producer. So we always start at the very bottom of our food chain with a producer. Remember, the producers are those organisms which take the energy from the sun and use it to create food. For that reason, they must be at the base of any food chain. In this case, we see that grass is our producer. The second link or rung in a food chain is the predator of the consumer. We say predator in air quotes because you don't really think of predation when you think of an animal eating grass. It doesn't really run, so it doesn't really need to be hunted. But what we mean is whichever organism eats the producer. In this case, we have a grasshopper, and this food chain arrow is showing me that energy is going from the grass into the grasshopper, which means that the grasshopper is consuming that grass for food. As we move up the food chain, we go in a very similar direction. So we can see the frog and then the snake. So depending on your ecosystem, each following step simply follows with the predator of the organism before it, or what eats the organism before it in the food chain. So in this case, step 3, we see a frog. This arrow is showing me that energy is flowing from the grasshopper to the frog, telling me that that frog consumes or gets energy from the grasshopper. Likewise, for the snake, we see that the snake is one step above the frog, telling us that energy is flowing from frog to snake, meaning that snake is consuming frogs for food. Finally, we work our way up to the top of the chain, again, depending on how large the food chain is. In this case, we have our eagle. And the final organism of the food chain does not have any predators, meaning there's no one in that ecosystem that actually eats that organism. In the case of the eagle here, he doesn't have anyone in this ecosystem that's hunting him or eating him as food. Now, let's look at how we can create our own food chains when we know information about what's taking place in that ecosystem. So here in the table, we can see that we are given some information about the ecosystem and the interactions in this ecosystem. We can see on the left-hand column, we're given the organisms that are present. So we see that we have a cactus, a hawk, a kangaroo rat, and a snake. In the middle column, we're told what the prey of that animal is, or what that animal eats in order to obtain its energy. Finally, in the third column, we see the predator. This is telling us what is the predator of that organism, or what is hunting and eating that organism for energy. Using this information, we can go ahead and create our own food chain to represent how energy flows. So like we talked about in the last step, the first thing that we want to do is identify what is that lowest link on the food chain. Remember that the lowest link on any food chain is the producer. So if we look at these organisms, you probably, even without really analyzing the information, can determine between a snake, a kangaroo rat, a hawk, and a cactus, which is the producer. We know the producers are plants, they're photosynthetic, so we know here that that would be the cactus. However, if we want to look at our table, we can come over here to the prey column and see that with air quotes, the cactus has prey that is the sun. That means that the cactus is obtaining its energy from the sun. We know that that is true of photosynthetic organisms, so that confirms for us that the cactus is the lowest link on our food chain. So I will go ahead and start my food chain down at the bottom with the cactus. We then use arrows in order to represent the flow of energy. So we know that energy is going from the cactus into whatever the next organism is, because we know that the cactus is the lowest link on the food chain. So now what we want to do is go ahead and find the organism that is that next link of the chain. That would be the organism that consumes or preys upon the cactus. So if we look up here, we can see two ways. We can see that the predator of the cactus is the kangaroo rat. See that here. We also can look down here and see what organism has cactus as a prey. This confirms for us that it is indeed the kangaroo rat. So I will go ahead and add my kangaroo rat to the next step in my food chain. Again, we know that as I move up the food chain, energy is going from the prey item into the predator. So I'll go ahead and put my arrow there now to show that flow of energy. And now I want to look for whichever organism preys upon the kangaroo rat, or whichever is the predator of the kangaroo rat. We can see here that I look at kangaroo rat, its predator is the snake. That tells me that snake should be my next link. So I'll place him here. Now we only have one organism left, but let's go ahead and confirm in our table that what we've done makes sense. Let's look for hawk. So hawk should have snake as prey, or snake should have hawk as a predator. It looks like both cases are confirmed there. The hawk's prey is the snake, and the snake's predator is the hawk, telling us that we have indeed done our food chain correctly. And now we have a food chain that represents the flow of energy through this ecosystem, starting with the producer, down here, the cactus, and ending with this apex predator, the hawk. Finally, let's talk about how changes to populations within a food chain can affect other populations. So this idea is what we call resource availability. So when we say resource in ecology, we're just talking about a substance or a material that is needed. We are primarily talking about food or prey. So we know that in order to stay alive, predators need their prey. We need that food that is going to create our energy. When we talk about resource availability, we're talking about the description of how much resource or needed material is present or available in the ecosystem. And this availability of resources can affect the populations that depend upon those resources. So we can talk about two instances that changes in resource availability can cause a change in the populations that need those resources. So first, we can see an increase in food availability or an increase in prey. You probably could guess that if there's more food, more prey, more resource available, that will cause an increase in the predator population. For example, if we were to say that there was an increase in the snake population in this ecosystem, we could also predict that there would be an increase in hawk population. There's more snakes for those hawks to eat. Therefore, more hawks are able to eat and survive. On the other hand, we could also see a decrease in food availability or a decrease in the prey needed by that predator. On the other hand, this would cause the opposite effect. If there's less food or less prey available, we would see a decrease in the predator population. There's less food available to sustain that population, hence less of that organism will be able to survive. For example, if we saw a decrease in the population of grass plants in this ecosystem, we could also assume that we would see a decrease in the grasshopper population. Less grass available to be eaten by the grasshoppers, less grasshoppers that will be able to eat and survive.